So our next guest is Peter Benjaminson, and Peter is an author of, Peter writes about Black entertainers from a historical perspective, and he's released several books along those lines. He'll tell you about some. I know he did one on Mary Wells and some other artists. And his latest book, though, is about the animated character Betty Boop and about her connection to African American entertainment historically. So, Peter, welcome to Black Authors Matter TV. Oh, you need to unmute your mic.
There we go.
Okay.
Much better.
Yeah, right. Yes, I could just sit here flapping my lips, but it wouldn't be that entertaining. Yes, listen, thanks very much for having me on the show in spite of my technological obsolescence.
Well, thank you for being here.
Okay.
Thank you. I know I mentioned Mary Wells, but name some of the other Black artists that you've written historical books about.
Well, I wrote the first book ever published in this country on the Motown Record Corporation. It was called The Story of Motown, which is pretty straightforward. And as I said, it was the first book ever. So I was the first to ever mention in book form all of the great Motown stars that had starred at Motown in the 60s and 70s. The book came out in 79, and then it was recently re-released in an updated edition by Rare Bird Books. It's available on Amazon.com. And I think it was, since it was the first book, it didn't go quite as far as the other books, later books did. There have been 100 books since on Motown, but I was proud to have started it off. I mean, I was a reporter for the Detroit Free Press, and I realized that neither of the big papers in the city was giving Motown the coverage it deserved, and certainly the publishing industry wasn't. So that book was my attempt to write that scale. Then it did so well, I really got into the subject. I wrote the book called The Lost Supreme, The Life of Dream Girl Florence Ballard.
Oh, wow.
Which she asked me to co-author it with her. And that's exactly what I did. Although she died at age 32, I'm still splitting all the royalties with her daughters. So, that makes me feel good. In the book was it's still selling. There's movie interest in it. And then I wrote a book about Mary Wells. None of these people had books written about them previously. So I think I was plowing a path, if that's the word, or making a road, making a road and then walking on it for all the people who wanted to learn more about the three of them. And then I wrote a book about Rick James called Super Freak, The Life of Rick James. And he was in Motown for a while. A more popular writer than I am, whose name I'm not even going to mention on the show, wrote a book that just barely beat mine in. And his David Ritz is his name. His book was better, I admit it. And he so. But so that answers your question, I think.
Well, I think it's really interesting that you were able to connect with so many celebrities, and it seemed like they sought you out in certain ways to help them to write their books.
Well, Flo certainly did. I was a reporter for the Detroit Free Press, and she had been unfairly kicked out of the Supremes and out of Motown. I went over to interview her. I did a big story on her. Then she called me up and said, I like the story. Let's make it into a book. The other two, Rick and Mary, had died before I was able to write anything about them. But I saw the same kind of thing. Not enough people, in my humble opinion, were paying attention to them, and would really want to read books about their very interesting lives. That's the same feeling I had when I started on this Betty Boop book. She's been a character in cartoons for almost a century now, and there's no book except mine, The Life and Times of Betty Boop, that has ever been written about such a major character. There are plenty of books on other cartoon characters, but none on Betty. Tell me if I'm talking too much. I like to talk.
Oh, no,
No,
this
not talking too much at
your
all.
world. This is
Yeah.
this is your world and your time. So
Okay.
I want to hear about what you're doing. I do have a question before we get into the Betty Boop book. I didn't realize you had roots in Detroit, which makes perfect sense with the Motown
Yeah.
connection. And when you were a reporter for the Detroit Free Press, was your focus on entertainment, or were you a general reporter, like just overall?
No, actually, I was mostly a city hall reporter. Uh, so this was odd, but I like music, and there's a lot of music going on in Detroit. Certainly
Yeah.
at that time, there may well still be, but this was the big upsurge in the Motown record company. To be accurate, it had occurred just a few years before, in the 60s. I got there in the 70s. It was still going, but what was attractive to me was that there were many people around who had worked for Motown, and had clear opinions about it on both sides, how good it was, how maybe what its failures were. So it looked like just a big gold mine to walk into it, extract stuff. And that's basically what I did.
There was a documentary, I think it's called The Making of Motown, that's been on cable. I forgot which network. It's either Showtime. I don't think it's HBO, but it had Berry Gordy and Smokey Robinson talking throughout the documentary, and then they had the footage from when they first started Motown. It's just really, really interesting how how they how they did more than just make music. They were
Right.
really on the cusp of change in the country. And when they work with their artists, they they tried to find the right songs for them. But they also, I know there was a thing about, they were with the Supremes and the like Martha Reeves and the Vandellas and other groups. They got etiquette lessons because they were supposed to be classy and to really elevate um, their persona to really be fashionable and just very classy ladies. And so it was a overall, uh, I guess that Motown took the artists and they did more than just write songs and sing them. They they really fashioned their images, and a lot of them were very, very young.
Oh, they're terribly young.
Very, very young.
Yeah.
Most of them were minors. They had to have their mothers sign their contracts because you had to be 18 in Michigan to sign a binding contract. They weren't 18, so the mothers were older, of course, but they didn't know that much about the music business, and so a lot of the contracts were fairly one-sided. But
Yeah,
nevertheless,
that left a lot of room for them to get taken advantage of because everybody was excited about being big stars, but they didn't understand the actual business of music.
that's it. That's it. No, I thought it was very interesting. We should get on the Betty Boop, but I thought it was very interesting that they combined black and white music. That was their real trick, or their real innovation, to put it in a better way. Black music and white music obviously have been around for centuries, but to combine them in an American situation was a work of great genius. I think it deserved to be written about as much as possible. And there are hundreds of books now about Motown. So,
Right.
Well, believe it or not, this is actually a good segue into Betty Boop.
right.
And I've always loved the Betty Boop character. And I think I was much older before I really learned her story. And so I'm not going to try to tell the story. I want to turn that over to you. But I'm really glad that you wrote this book, because there are a lot of stories that are kind of swirling around about who Betty Boop really was.
Yes, that's a good point. Betty, well, one of the things that made Betty very popular, and I'll get into what you're saying in a minute, is that she started after World War I. That's when she became, she started in 1930, but her persona was based on the flappers. Those were women who probably weren't going to get married after World War I, because so many people, so many men had been killed. They became much more independent as women. They were called flappers because for some reason they wore winter boots like everybody else, but they left the tops of the boots open. So when they walked down the street, you could hear them coming. It's like they flapped.
Yes.
But they were very interested in progressing in life, even though they weren't married, or had children. And that's one of the things that Betty represents. She's had a long career now, as I said, almost a century. And she's had boyfriends. She seems to have had sex, although obviously it's not shown. It's implied. But she doesn't seem to have any children, and she certainly never got married, in spite of fighting off various men who wanted to marry. So she represents the ideal, in a way, for many people, of an independent woman. That attracts both white and black people. The black link with Betty is, well, there are several of them. One is she was modeled on an actress named Helen Kane, who was a white woman who was a big star in the 1930s. And Helen had modeled herself on a couple of black entertainers, black female entertainers, who had perfected the scat thing. Yeah, it's where you use language that doesn't mean anything but adds a lot to your act. And they kept saying, boop boop we do, boop boop we do.
Yes.
Boop, and Helen was in a Harlem nightclub and watching one or two of these women do this, and she thought, this is a great idea. I can see why this is so popular. I mean, the nightclubs are full, people were applauding and stuff. So she made it into she was a Broadway star, and she used the whole boop boop doop thing and her curly hair to get ahead of the theater world. And that's who Betty Boop was built on. She's a cartoon version of Helen Kane, but Helen Kane was a white version of of 2 or 3 black women who she saw live that she was trying to copy. It makes it a very interesting story. Actually, Helen eventually got PO'd that the Fleischers, the cartoonists, had modeled Betty Boop on her and were making a lot of money and getting very popular. So she sued the Fleischers in New York court. It was a big trial covered by all the papers, and she lost because the other side pointed out that she had stolen it from 2 black women. So you can't steal something and then say, oh, they stole it from me after I stole it. The law doesn't go for that. So she lost the suit, and Betty's been popular now for almost 100 years because she's built on the basically genius of the black women who she imitated, and because the Fleischers, who ran the studio right here in New York, kept making her independent and a model for all women, or every woman who doesn't want to necessarily be required to get married, have kids, and stay home. That was Betty's secret, such as it was.
Okay.
So what's interesting to me, and I'm sorry, Glenn, but what's interesting to me that this was a white woman who kind of, I guess, modeled herself after the black women that she saw, but the character, I've always thought the character looked black.
Oh, maybe it's because of her. I don't think her
it wasn't so much about the skin. I think it was the hair.
Yeah. The hairstyle was like Dorothy Dandridge's hair, and a couple of other women during the 50s more, during that time where they would wear it was curly and close to the face. And that's a style that you see on, I guess it was on white women in like the early, like some of those silent movies, which I can't really watch, but they have a close hair, the hair close to their head and curly. But then in the 50s, Black women were wearing their hair like that as well.
Right. Well, it was a copy of Baby Esther. I just remembered her name. She was a black nightclub performer.
Yes.
You know, Helen Keynes, that's great look, great act. You know, and she made her hair up just like that. So it was a copy in the sense that she looked like her. You could argue that it's a ripoff. It was a ripoff. I guess it was a ripoff. But people, when I talk to people about that, I have to point out that, you know, well, it happened with rock and roll too. Black people invented rock and roll. Then Elvis started ripping them off, or excuse me, imitating them creatively. But then other people imitated him creatively too, and a whole new field opened. You know, it's not like you can say, "I'm sorry, we only going to allow one person to do that." You know,
right?
No one else could do it. Then it spreads out. I mean, Beethoven imitated Mozart or whatever, and some of their music was probably similar, but still, the original Black women were successful. They were performing in Europe and in America, but they should have been given more credit. That's absolutely true.
And Florence Mills was the other Black woman.
Yes, thank you. Right. So that's one of the things that made Betty so popular, was that she was drawing. You know, she became a truly American figure. She drew races together in terms of what their preferred entertainers looked like. She's still around now, obviously. There's a musical that just opened in Chicago, which plans to come to New York. I hope they do, because I can go out and sell my books in front of the theater without, you know. Well, I have no shame, man. When the Motown movie came here, I forgot the name of it, but it's about Motown. They were going to call it The Story of Motown, but then they realized it was the same title as my book, so they changed the movie. I was selling books out in front of the theater. I mean, why not? We're all working together. We're all working the same gold mine together. Let's go for it. Just a thought.
I'm just picturing you doing this. I mean, did you set up a table, or did you walk up with a trench coat and say, "Got a book for you"?
Well, no, in this case, let me get to what I'm doing now. The Betty is so popular. If you look on eBay, I think I looked this morning, there are 180,000 separate Betty Boop products available on eBay. The Fleischers lost the copyright some time ago, so anyone can make a Betty Boop jacket, skirt, hat, you know, doll. But the fact that there are 180,000 products, individual products available, shows how popular she is. You know, these people aren't making these things and putting them up because they want praise. They want to sell them to the other people, and obviously someone's buying them. Otherwise, they wouldn't go to this tremendous amount of trouble. So obviously, Betty means a lot.
Yes, she does.
Probably to women, because she represents such an independent, creative, and self-aware woman. The sort of the ideal American woman for several different races, I would think.
An independent woman who still made sure she looked good every time she left her house.
That's right. That's right. You know,
she was always the same age. She never aged. So, but you know, when things come back around, recycle in terms of popularity to a new generation, they see things from a different vantage point than the original intent. You know, it's like when Malcolm X, every so many years, Malcolm X really becomes popular again. He never completely wanes in popularity, but each new generation, they have a different take on it, or they see it as resistance. Malcolm X kind of symbolizes that for each generation. But then they'll have different different clothes, different apparel, different symbols that they use. So you just never know. Now she also in the cartoons that Betty Boop was in, she had several black bands, big bands.
Oh,
So
yes.
tell us about that part.
Yeah, she sang a lot of songs, and other people in the cartoons also sang songs. And the she made arrangements to have various bands, black bands, perform at the beginning of each cartoon. They'd perform one of their songs, and then in the cartoon, she'd do a sort of a cartoon based on another song that that same band had performed. So they got to do two songs in each cartoon. And they really loved it because the Fleischers, excuse me, who had arranged it so that the cartoons, which are very popular in the 30s, of course, there was no TV, so they're only shown in theaters, were shown during or just before a performance of the black band that was featured in the cartoon. So like Betty would do a cartoon based on a Louis Armstrong composition or performance. He'd be in the cartoon, and then people would be told that the Louis was going to play down the street, at some other theater. This increased revenues terrifically. I mean, again, with no TV, if you wanted to see a band, you had to go to a club or theater. So it was very good for them. On the other hand, they did engage, Betty, I should say, and her backers did sometimes engage in racial stereotypes. There was one particularly bad one where Louis Armstrong a couple of Betty and some of her pals went to Africa, were captured by cannibals, and they had Louis Armstrong's face. They gave him an African headdress and beads in his nose or whatever. It made him look like an African tribesman. It was very insulting. However, that was the only time they really screwed up on that. The rest of the time, they had the characters in non-racist poses, but or non-racist roles. But you got to remember.
I remember seeing that picture.
Yeah, it's trying to remember the name of it. I can't, but you can find it easily. It's the only I think it's the only cartoon that Louis Armstrong and his band were in. But they went along with it. It was mild. They didn't actually say anything about him, and they were making tons of money from people rushing maybe the next day to see his concert down the street at some other theater. They shouldn't have done it, but
those were the signs of the times back then, though, right?
Thank you. That's just what I was going to say. I mean, the fact, you could say they were really advanced. They had black and white people in the same cartoon, and the blacks were treated as equals, in the cartoon. That certainly wasn't happening in the movies that they were showing at the same theaters. That was very rare. I'm not trying to excuse anything, but you got to realize it was a different era.
This is in the 1930s. That's almost 100 years ago. And a lot of, if you look at some of the films where Black people were at the time, they talked about how the roles that they were able to get were so limited because they generally were servants. Well, if it was historical, they were actually slaves, like Gone with the Wind. But then if it was a more contemporary at that time, they were still maids or chauffeurs or butlers, or just comedic sidekicks, so to speak, like Amos and Andy. So they would talk about it was very difficult to get roles that were beyond that.
Yes, that's true. And I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt. I'm just going to say one of the people that Betty really helped was Cab Calloway, who did, I think, one or two major cartoons with her. His band performed, on stage, and then his compositions were used in the cartoon section. And it was obvious they made a cartoon version of him. He went from being, filmed on the stage, and then he became a cartoon figure along interacting with Betty. There was a big one about they were all in a cave, and he was playing something, and ghosts would appear. It's a great cartoon. Like I say, you can see them all on YouTube. And the Fleischers must hate this because people are watching them in the millions and they don't get any money. It's because they lost the copyright some time ago. So I'd be pissed. They probably are. Just a thought.
Well, I think copyrights, how long do they last? Is it 75 years? Is it, do you
I
know?
think
It's somewhere like that.
You're right, but you have to renew it after 38 years or something. And I think someone failed to do that.
Okay. Okay.
That's
Well,
what happened.
yeah, that was Cab Calloway, and then a band leader called Don Redman,
Yes.
also in the
Yes.
cartoons, in the Betty Boop cartoons.
Yes, he made another Redman, Calloway, and Armstrong were the big three there, and they were all very pleased, apparently, to participate in the cartoons. I'm sure Armstrong didn't like being, stereotyped. But on the other hand, he got to sing one of his songs in the cartoon, which was, I'm sure it made it much more popular. He was a recording artist, and he sold it. So in any case, they went along with it, and 2 out of 3 times Betty got it right. So that's something for those days. Just a thought.
Yep. So the book was released, the Betty Boop book, November 15th. So
yeah.
What was that? About a week ago.
Yes, that's right. Yes. And to show what the interest is like in Betty Boop, the musical called Boop, the musical, which stars a black woman, by the way, which I think is very equitable.
The black woman is playing Betty Boop?
Yes. Yeah.
Interesting.
It opened on the 19th. So there was almost simultaneously a book on Betty and a musical about Betty. The first musical ever and the first book ever came out. I mean, it's probably the 100-year mark approaching that reminded people that there was, and the hundreds of thousands of products available showed how much people were interested in America on the cartoon and in the character. And she still represents an independent woman, which, not dragged down by having to, I don't know, work at a store and then come home and take care of the kids and then take care of the husband. She does none of that stuff. Well, maybe she worked in a store, but she tried to own the store. That was it. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah. Well, for those who didn't know about the connection with Betty Boop and Black artists from the 1930s, your book will allow people to learn more about that, because that's like little known history that doesn't really get discussed.
Yes.
And when people think of Betty Boop, they probably don't know about Cab Calloway or Esther Jones or Florence Mills and their connection to her.
And I don't think they always think about the impact that she had on women, on the impact that she's had on popular culture. Because just as you said earlier, there are what would you say, over 100,000 pieces of art with her likeness on it now, or
jackets or whatever.
Right.
Speaking of influence, Marilyn Monroe, she did a movie. I forgot the name of it, but she in the movie she did a terrific song in which she inserted the phrase "boop boop be doo" out of nowhere. It was like a tribute to Betty.
Something Like It Hot, I think.
Thank you. Something Like It Hot. That was it. Yeah. That's the one that had Jack Lemmon and some other guy dressed up as women.
Curtis. Tony
Curtis. Right.
I've seen it multiple times.
See you, Gwen. Go ahead, girl.
I Want to Be Loved by You. That was the song.
Yes. That's it. Very good.
That's it. Multiple times. It's really a classic.
That was Marilyn's tribute to Betty and to Esther Jones too. So she's still carrying on. I mean, something about that is really grabbing people. I hadn't realized how big a grab that was until I started doing this research. She hit some vein or nerve somewhere, and a lot of people are reacting positively to it, in spite of sins that the some of the racial sins the Fleischers might have committed.
Well, I am glad that you wrote this book, and hopefully it'll awaken a new love and respect for Betty Boop, and like I said, the impact that she's had on culture.
Thank you.
And that hopefully these two women who inspired the character Betty Boop will also get their due as well.
Yes, yeah. Well, unfortunately, they're real women, so they're deceased. Yeah. That's the luck of being a cartoon character.
Yeah, doesn't mean we can't remember who they are, though.
That's exactly right, and they're both covered to great extent in the book and how they influenced Betty. So if you're interested in that, I'd suggest you buy the book. And I'm not trying just to sell books. Okay, I am just trying to sell books, but
selling books. You're an author.
That's what we do on this show. We sell books. So
that's right. Yeah, you'll find descriptions of both those women and how Betty basically either stole from them or or took their stuff or lived on their reputations. However you want to look at it, it's all in the Betty Boop book, which is the first book ever written about her.
Okay, can you show us the cover one more time? We're at the end of our time. Okay, the life and times of Betty Boop.
Yeah.
Peter Benjaminson.
The 100-year history of an animated icon, and it's only $19.95, which is actually low for a book. You can get it on Amazon or lots of bookstores.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Peter, for being a guest on Black Authors Matter TV, and continued success with your book on Betty Boop and your other work.
Thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity.
We enjoyed talking with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
You too. Bye-bye.